Life as a taxi driver isn't easy. Long hours, low pay, endless traffic, and worst of all, passengers who sometimes make things worse. For one man, this job wasn't just about driving. It was about survival. He had a family to feed, bills to pay, a home to keep. Every fare mattered, every tip helped. He wasn't always a taxi driver. Years ago, life was different, but fate had other plans. He lost his old job, and driving a taxi became his only way to make ends meet. Each day, he woke up before sunrise, ready for another long shift. Some days were good, some were bad, but he always pushed through. Then, one day, everything changed. It started like any other shift. Pick up passengers, drop them off, repeat. But a small mistake, something he never expected, put his entire career in danger. Maybe it was a traffic violation, maybe a misunderstanding with a passenger, maybe a complaint he didn't deserve. Whatever it was serious. His boss called him in. The company was ready to fire him. He begged for another chance. He had no backup plan. But rules were rules. The company refused to listen. Now, he had one last option: fight for his job in court. He never imagined his life would depend on a judge's decision, and he definitely never imagined that judge would uncover something shocking about his past. The taxi driver sat in his car, hands gripping the steering wheel. His mind raced. How had things gone so wrong? He had always followed the rules, always done his best. But none of that mattered now. It all started with a single passenger. A man in a suit, rushing to a meeting. He seemed impatient, checking his watch over and over. The driver took a shortcut, a street he had driven through 100 times before, but this time something was different. A traffic light he swore had been green, a camera flashing as he passed. Later, a complaint from the passenger. He claimed the driver was reckless, said he had nearly caused an accident. It wasn't true. The driver knew it, but no one cared. The company called him in the next morning. The manager shook his head. "This isn't your first warning," he said. The driver protested. "I've been careful. I have a clean record." But the complaint was serious. The company couldn't afford bad publicity. "We have to let you go," the manager said. His voice was firm, final. The driver felt his world collapse. No job meant no money. No money meant no way to feed his family. Desperate, he begged. "Please, give me another chance." The manager hesitated, then sighed. "There's one option," he said. "A court hearing. A judge would decide. If the judge ruled in his favor, he could keep his job. If not, it was over." With no other choice, the driver agreed. He had never been to court before, never stood before a judge. Now, everything depended on one decision. The taxi driver sat in the courtroom, his hands clenched together. His heart pounded. This was his last chance. He looked around. The room was cold, silent, a place where decisions were made, lives changed. At the front, the judge entered, an older man, serious, focused. He took his seat, adjusting his glasses. The taxi company's lawyer stood up first. He spoke with confidence. "Your Honor, this driver has a history of reckless behavior. Our company cannot take risks." The driver felt a lump in his throat. That wasn't true. He had been careful. He had done his best. The lawyer continued. "We have a complaint from a passenger. The driver ran a red light, almost caused an accident." The judge turned to the taxi driver. "What do you have to say for yourself?" The driver swallowed hard. He stood up, voice shaking. "Your Honor, I've been a taxi driver for years. I've never had a major issue." The judge watched him closely. "I didn't run a red light," the driver continued. "The light was green when I passed." The lawyer smirked. "Do you have proof?" The driver hesitated. "That camera, would it show the truth?" The judge tapped his fingers on the desk. "I want to see the footage," he said. A court assistant played the traffic camera recording. Everyone watched in silence. The driver held his breath. The video showed his car approaching the light. The moment the light turned yellow. The second he passed through. Then, the unexpected. Another car behind him sped through, much later, when the light was red. That was the real danger. The judge leaned forward. He replayed the video. Finally, he spoke. "This driver did not run a red light. The complaint is incorrect." The taxi company's lawyer opened his mouth, but the judge raised a hand. "The evidence is clear." The driver felt his knees weaken. Relief washed over him. Then the judge's voice came again. "Case dismissed. The driver may keep his job." The driver wanted to thank him, but something about the judge's expression made him pause. It was as if the judge recognized him. The taxi driver stood frozen, unable to believe what he had just heard. He had won. The judge had dismissed the case. He could keep his job. Relief flooded through him. He wanted to thank the judge, to say something, but his words wouldn't come. The courtroom was clearing out, but the judge remained seated, staring at him. His expression unreadable. For a moment, the driver hesitated. Was something wrong? Then, the judge spoke. "What's your full name again?" The driver furrowed his brows. "Daniel Carter, Your Honor." The judge nodded slowly, deep in thought. He glanced down at the papers in front of him, as if confirming something. "Daniel Carter," he repeated under his breath. The driver shifted uncomfortably. "Is everything all right, Your Honor?" The judge snapped back to the present. His face returned to the calm, professional expression he had worn throughout the case. "Yes," he said quickly. "You're free to go. The case is closed." The driver hesitated for another second, then gave a small nod. "Thank you, Your Honor." With that, he turned and left the courtroom. Outside, the fresh air hit him like a wave. He had walked in fearing the worst, but now, he could breathe again. His job was safe. His family would be all right. But inside the courtroom, the judge still sat at his desk. His fingers tapped lightly against the table. His gaze was fixed on the papers in front of him. Daniel Carter. Why did that name sound so familiar? He reached for an old case file on his shelf. A file from years ago. His hand trembled as he opened it. His eyes scanned the pages. Then suddenly he stopped. His breath caught in his throat. It couldn't be. But it was. Daniel Carter wasn't just another taxi driver. He was someone from the judge's past, someone tied to a secret the judge had buried long ago, and now that secret was coming back to life. The judge sat alone in his office, the courtroom now empty. But his mind was racing. Daniel Carter. That name, that face. It was more than just a taxi driver fighting for his job. Something about him felt familiar. The judge pulled out an old case file, dust settling as he flipped through the pages. It was a case from many years ago, a case he had nearly forgotten, until now. His eyes scanned the documents, his breath slow and heavy, and then, he saw it, a name, the same name, Daniel Carter. But the details didn't match. This wasn't about a taxi driver, this was something much bigger. The file told a different story, a crime, an accusation, a courtroom battle. The judge's pulse quickened. He flipped another page, a photo paper clipped to the report. It was him. A younger Daniel Carter staring back. The judge leaned back in his chair, his heartbeat echoing in his ears. This wasn't a coincidence. This man, the taxi driver he had just ruled in favor of, had been in his courtroom before. But not as a struggling worker. As a defendant. The judge remembered now. A case from over a decade ago. A young man accused of a crime he swore he didn't commit. A case that had ended badly. A case the judge had always regretted. Slowly, he closed the file. His hands were shaking. Daniel Carter had no idea. No idea that the man who had just saved his job was the same judge who had once sealed his fate. And now, the judge had a decision to make. Would he stay silent, or would he face the truth about what happened all those years ago? The judge couldn't sleep that night. The name, the face, the case, it was all coming back. Daniel Carter. Years ago he had been just a kid. Young, scared, standing in this very courtroom, fighting for his freedom. The case had been complicated. A robbery. A suspect caught at the wrong place at the wrong time. No solid evidence, just circumstantial proof and a witness who wasn't completely reliable. But back then, the judge had been different. Stricter. Less willing to see the gray areas. Daniel had pleaded his innocence. Said he had nothing to do with the crime. But the system worked against him. A guilty verdict. A prison sentence. The judge had moved on. Cases came and went. But now, all these years later, that same boy had stood before him again. This time as a man. A hard-working taxi driver just trying to survive. The irony stung. The judge sat at his desk, staring at Daniel's case file. Guilt pressed down on his chest. Had he ruined an innocent man's life? Had Daniel suffered for something he didn't do? The judge thought back to the trial. He had been certain of his decision then. But now, doubt crept in. What if he had been wrong? And what if Daniel never knew? The judge had two choices. He could close the file, pretend this never happened, or he could tell the truth. But what would that change? Daniel had built a new life. He had found a way forward. Would bringing up the past fix anything? Or would it only reopen old wounds? The judge exhaled sharply. His hands gripped the file, his mind racing. The past was standing right in front of him, and for the first time in his career, he didn't know what to do. The judge sat in silence, staring at the case file. His hands were shaking. The truth was clear now. Daniel Carter had once been a young man fighting for justice, and the judge had been the one who failed him. He wanted to believe he had made the right decision back then, that the evidence had been strong, that the verdict had been fair. But doubt was eating him alive. What if Daniel had been innocent all along? What if the system had destroyed his life for no reason? The judge looked out the window. The city lights flickered in the distance. Somewhere out there, Daniel was driving his taxi, completely unaware of the truth. Did he remember the judge from all those years ago? Or was he just another face in a system that had already forgotten him? The judge clenched his jaw. He could tell Daniel. He could admit his mistake, apologize. But would that change anything? Daniel had moved on. He had built a life for himself, despite everything. Would dragging the past back into the present only make things worse? The judge closed the file and leaned back in his chair. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure what justice meant anymore. The truth was heavy. And now, he had to decide whether to carry it alone, or finally let Daniel know what really happened all those years ago.